Hello, everyone. Before we get started, we would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on Indigenous land. Moreover, we would like to acknowledge and pay our respects to the Carrizo and Comecrudo, Coahuiltecan, Caddo, Tonkawa, Comanche, Lipan Apache, Alabama Coushatta, Kickapoo, Isleta del su Pueblo, and all the American Indian and Indigenous peoples and communities who have been or have become a part of these lands and territories in Texas, here on Turtle Island. We're glad you're here with us for On Course with Liberal Arts. Today's topic is the changing face of Native American religions. It is my honor to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jennifer Graber. Dr. Graber teaches undergraduate classes in the College of Liberal Arts on the history of religion in the United States, religion in the American West, Native American religions, and religious freedom. She teaches graduate seminars on religion and violence, religion and empire, and approaches to the study of religion in the U.S. Dr. Graber is serving as the interim director of UT's program in Native American and Indigenous Studies. Please send your questions to the panel via the chat function, and we will answer as many questions as possible in the last half of the webinar. And now I will turn it over to Dr. Graber.
Hello, thank you so much for having me, and thanks to all of you who have joined us for this webinar. I'm really excited to share a little bit about the research that I do and to talk a little bit about the ways I teach Native American religions to UT students. So I'm going to share my screen with you right now so that we can get started. All right. So what I'd like to do is start with an image of a shield that could be used in battle. And this was a shield owned by a Kiowa Indian named Crowneck. His English name could be translated into Crowneck, and this is a drawing of his shield. Kiowa men carried shields not only as protection in battle, right, against things like arrows and eventually bullets, but shields were understood to have a spiritual or religious dimension to them as well. They were painted with designs and colors that men received in visions. They might also pass these designs and colors down to their descendants. And these shields were thought to have a kind of power that went above and beyond the physical attributes, but that the colors and designs added a sort of supernatural layer of protection around the bearer of the shield. So this shield belonged to a Kiowa man named Crowneck, and the story of his shield, every shield had a story, comes from around the 1850s. And in it, Crowneck was on a raid down into what we now think of as northern Mexico, where he met some Mescalero Apaches. And while he was there, the Mescalero Apaches gave him a small cactus called peyote. And they showed him how, in a dried form, you could ingest peyote and have some sort of religious or supernatural experience. They called it a kind of medicine that they offered to Crowneck in hospitality. So Crowneck ingested the peyote and had a vision in which he received this shield design. So he went home, he made the shield after the pattern he had received in the dream. He then carried this shield for many, many years, and he only gave it up and destroyed it once he had carried it into battle and had been unsuccessful. So for quite some time, he considered it to have a sort of supernatural protective power over him. And in some ways, the shield's origin story connects us to another origin story, which is about the way the Mescalero Apaches began to ingest peyote in the first place. The way they tell the story is that a Mescalero Apache woman was lost in the desert. She was seeking her brothers who she had become separated from, and she worried at some point after many hours of separation that she would actually perish in the desert. At that time, at this point of real vulnerability, she heard a voice speaking to her, and it was a plant, a cactus plant. And this plant told her that it could be used and ingested as medicine. And she then said that the moon began to speak to her, telling her how to ingest the plant, how to sing and pray after ingesting, and that after she did this, she was helped and able to find her brothers. Once she found her brothers, she told them about this plant. And when they went back to the larger gathering of Mescalero Apaches, they passed that story on to them, beginning among the Mescalero Apaches, the beginning of ritual peyote ingestion. So we have two origin stories. And Croneck, who carried this shield among the Kiowa, was known for many years for having this shield among him. When Kiowa elders were interviewed by an anthropologist later, many years later in the 1890s, they recognized it right away. And when the anthropologist asked them, what is it that this shield design is like? They said, it looks like a peyote button. Right here on the right, we see the top of a peyote cactus. And so in this dream, Croneck had received a design that mimicked the shape and the patterns within a peyote button, which he considered to be a powerful medicine in his life. So here's this powerful medicine that one man experienced in the 1850s. But Croneck was unusual. He was one of the very few people in Kiowa life who actually ever ingested peyote at that time. In fact, peyote ingestion did not take off among the Kiowa until a little bit in the 1870s, and with much more energy and practice in the 1880s. So one of the questions I had when I was reading these stories is, why is that? If they knew from Croneck's experience about the power of ritual peyote ingestion, if they had a man who was among them and carried a shield with its design, why was it not ingested by all? Why did they wait for 20, if not 30 years to start practicing it together? That was one of the questions I brought to my research. And one of the things I discovered as I began to do historical research and as I began to use theories from the discipline of religious studies to understand more about Kiowa religious life is that Kiowa religion, like many Native American religions, have a kind of additive quality. And what I mean by that is that there is a flexibility and an openness to adding new things. That when faced with problems that older resources can't confront, there's this openness to adding new. And so I want to talk a little bit today about the ways Kiowa religion was additive in the period of American colonization, and that it was this additive quality, this additive flexibility that provided for the kind of changes and prompted the changes in their religious life, and I think really happens in Native American religions more broadly. So let me give you a little background about the Kiowa. Here we see a map of the way that the Kiowa people migrated over many years. So they started way up at the top. If you look to the upper left of this migration map, some Kiowas say that they originated in what's now the Canadian Rockies. Others say in the valley of the Yellowstone River in what's now Montana. But what's important is that from these really kind of ancient times, they eventually migrated onto the high plains in the area that we now think of as the Badlands. They migrated there at a time when many Native peoples were coming onto the plains and developing what we would think of as the kind of classic horse and buffalo and teepee culture. Right, so here is an image of a Kiowa man, and this was a real cultural transformation for Kiowas and other Native people, including the Lakota Sioux, the Crow, the Cheyenne, all coming onto the plains from different directions in the period between the 14th and the 16th centuries, riding horses, hunting buffalo, using arrows, but eventually also using guns, and really developing what we think of in American popular culture as a plains Indian lifestyle. So the Kiowas developed that when they lived high up on the northern plains. But there were lots of powerful Indian nations there. The Kiowa were a kind of smaller nation, and they really got pushed out of the plains. And so in the late 18th century, they made their way down to what's now Oklahoma. And that's where they migrated permanently. They settled there, and they became allies with really the most powerful Indian nation on the southern plains, and one that many Texans are familiar with, the Comanche. So I want to say a little bit about the kind of religious life that developed among Kiowa while they made these migrations. When they lived way up north, their primary ritual object was a medicine bundle that had very significant items in it, and that was cared for by old men. When they came onto the plains, they were neighbors to Crow Indians who taught them a very important ritual that was really shared by many Plains Indian nations. It was called the Sundance. This is an image of Sundance Lodge, which the Kiowa called Ekado or Skado. And many Plains Indian nations made a lodge like this in which they would kind of construct pillars all around. They would have a central pole, and on that pole, they would place a buffalo hide and a variety of other offerings. So this developed for Kiowas and others. They learned and circulated this ritual between their various nations, and it was really a way for them to give thanks to both the sun and the buffalo as being really the central providers for their sustenance on the plains. When the Kiowa migrated down to the southern plains and when they became allies with the Comanche, they also shared this ritual with the Comanche, right? So we can already see before Kiowas ever met any colonizers from Europe or any Americans, they were already adding things throughout their migration journey. They already had a flexibility and openness to new rituals, and the Sundance was one of those. So by the time they get down into the southern plains, the place that they would stay permanently, they practiced the Sundance, and it was their most important ritual, and they shared it with their allies. They considered it really to be essential for their empowerment and their health as a people. So it's when they're living here that they meet Americans for the first time. They meet Americans probably in about the 1830s. It's a very late encounter when you compare it to some of the others that happen in Native North America. And really, the Americans don't try to make a real presence or really have control over that area until the 1860s, until after the Civil War. And when they do come, they want to create treaties with the Indian nations who are living there. These are very powerful Indian nations, the Kiowa and the Comanche. Americans know that they can't come in and just do whatever they want there, so they arrange for treaty negotiations. In 1867, I have an image here from the negotiations. They signed with the Kiowa and Comanche and Americans what's called the Treaty of Medicine Lodge. And the map on the bottom shows in black where that reservation was established, as well as the traditional lands that they had been inhabiting for several decades before agreeing to settle on the reservation. The reservation not only brought a kind of new lifestyle on bounded lands, it also introduced the Kiowa and Comanche to American missionaries. The first ones they met were Quakers, who came to run their reservation. And the Quakers were really interested in changing pretty much everything about Kiowa life. They wanted them to move out of teepees and live in permanent houses. They wanted them to stop hunting and start farming. They wanted to basically rehabilitate the gender roles and how children were raised. They wanted to change where hairstyles and forms of dress, religious life as well. They really sought this total transformation, which they talked about as civilization. The Kiowas at this time, they really weren't all that interested. They had enough room on their reservation to continue buffalo hunting. They had enough room to continue moving their teepees to different parts of the reservation and following the buffalo herds. Most of them did not really want to send their children to school, and most of them weren't interested at church, to go to church in this early period when the Quakers arrived in 1867. So they were really hoping to just kind of keep their processes, their cultural life going. But that did become hard over time, right? Over the years, the longer the Quakers were present, as more and more Americans came into the region, it began to be harder and harder for them to maintain, especially their religious traditions. So I want to talk about, when I introduce this idea of the changing face of Native religions, it really happens in this period after the Quakers arrive, after they are living this life on the reservation and are being pressured to change. And one of the things that they do is adjust how they practice the Sundance. That's one kind of change, not necessarily adding something new. But they also start to add things. This additive quality comes forward, and they add some new visionary leaders. They look to other Native nations and add things like peyote. And for some Kiowa, they actually add things from Americans, namely forms of Christian practice. So I want to talk about those three ways that these additions are made in Kiowa life, really bringing about a change in the religious landscape for the Kiowa. So you'll remember, we talked about how the Kiowa were practitioners of a Sundance ritual. Every year getting together, building this big encampment and going through a many days long ritual ceremony to thank and make offerings and make vows before the sun and the buffalo and other powerful forces that they understood to sustain them. And we know that the Kiowa kept on doing this even after the reservation was established, because they kept historical records about it. They didn't have a form of alphabetic script, but they did have a form of history keeping called the Saigut or Saikut. This often gets translated as winter count or calendar. And here you'll see one calendar that is created in a circle, and it has an entry for every winter and every summer, starting in the 1830s and going all the way into the 1890s. We have several calendars like this, kept by prominent Kiowa men, but also kept by kind of everyday Kiowa people. And what this allows us to do is to see how they tracked their history, including the religious changes that they underwent. So I just want to show you two examples of some of the entries. Most of the entries would feature a winter event and a summer event. And remember, they always held the Sundance in the summer. So you can see here on the right that they created they would actually put an image of the Medicine Lodge, of the Sundance Lodge in the calendar, and then some sort of little icon to show something that happened this summer. So on the left, we see that it's summer because of the Sundance Lodge. And then there's a war bonnet above. That's the summer that they captured a really prominent war bonnet from some neighboring Native peoples. On the right, we have an image also of the summer, and this one is about the year that they actually had lots of plants growing in the riverbed where they were practicing the Sundance, and it was also a time when they had very little rain, so it was dusty. We can see these entries progressing and carrying on for many years, even during the period of the reservation. So we know that they tried to keep the Sundance going. They tried to keep the Sundance going for many years after the reservation started, but it was difficult. It was difficult to maintain it. And one of the things that happened as they faced difficulties is that they began to add new things. So let's talk about the first new thing they added. The first that they added wasn't necessarily a big change, but it was a visionary leader. And Native groups all over North America had the kind of periodic uprising of a prophetic leader or a visionary leader who would have some sort of supernatural vision and call the people to a new way of life. And when this happened after colonization, it often involved a vision and a visionary proclaiming that they needed to give up items that they got from colonizers, that they needed to return to their older practices. So visionaries were a kind of common and periodic occurrence in many Native nations, including the Kiowa. But after the reservation was started and they were living there, a new visionary came kind of into prominence. His name was Goose Flying Overhead. That's how you translate his name. And he kind of began his visionary career in 1874. So it's after the reservation has been kind of in full swing for about 6 or 7 years. And he has a vision. And his vision actually is translated onto his shield. This is an image of his shield. He was already known as a person who had supernatural power. He was thought to be able to talk to owls and to understand what they said to him in return. He was understood to be a person who had certain kinds of healing powers. But in 1874, he got really, really sick. And he wasn't the only person who got sick. A bunch of Kiowas got sick when they ate the corn that Quakers had planted, But this corn was fairly unfamiliar to them, and they ate it while it was still raw rather than being ripe. And many, many people got sick, including Goose flying overhead. His relatives thought he had died. But after 2 days, he woke up saying that he had had a vision, and that in the vision, he had been spoken to once again by owls, and the owls told him that he and other Kiowa people could have new powers that would help them push the Americans out of their homelands. In fact, he said that they could be invulnerable to bullets. And we have a little sign of that. This is a drawing that an anthropologist made of Cronek's shield. You'll recognize on the bottom right, it looks a lot like the image that I just showed you. That's a drawing of the internal part of his shield. But over on the left, on the upper part, that's the outer wrapping that goes around his shield. And you can barely make out that there is a buffalo running in from the side and a squiggly line with a dot, and that's a bullet. And that was added after he had this vision in which he claimed that he and others who joined his movement could be invulnerable to American bullets. So he said, let's use this power to push the Americans out of here. And so that summer, when they gathered for the Sundance, he spread this story about the invulnerability to American bullets. He got a bunch of people to follow him, and he led Kiowas and some other Native people in an insurrection against American occupation. In fact, they joined up with the Comanche, who also had a visionary leader rising up at the same time. Some of you might have heard of this conflict. It's often been called the Red River War of 1874 and 1875. They went off on a variety of battles and incursions to push the Americans out. And Goose flying overhead eventually led his people to this place, which many of you, I think, will recognize, Palo Duro Canyon. He heard from his owls that that's where they should go and that the Americans would not find them. So they hid out in Palo Duro Canyon for several days. Unfortunately, they were found. His vision was proved to not be something that could sustain them against American attack. And he and many others were captured. Their insurrection was put down, and he and several others were actually imprisoned for their role in the Red River War. But I want to just emphasize that there is this new way. You can see the additive quality here. They had always had visionaries, but now they were adding visionary powers that particularly responded to colonizer objects like bullets, right? There's this new ability to take on new challenges, including objects from the colonizer. So Goose flying overhead went to jail, and so did many other Kiowa men, along with other men from the Southern Plains. And these men help us see a little bit about two bigger shifts in the changing face of Kiowa religion. So I want to turn to another one of those prisoners who was imprisoned after the Red River War. And the changes that we can see in his life involve Christianity and peyote. Bigger changes, bigger additions that are in some ways a very dramatic departure from earlier Kiowa practice. So here I need to show you an image of a man named Zotam. He is on the bottom left, and he is pictured here with several other Kiowa men on the first day that they are imprisoned. They were taken to a military fort in Florida called Fort Marion. Many of you might know it as St. Augustine. You can actually still visit this structure. They were imprisoned there in 1875, and they were given an indefinite sentence. They had no idea how long they would be there. And the man who ran the prison thought that the best way to work on transforming and changing Native people in a way that hadn't worked on reservations was to basically insist that it happen, to use coercion to make it happen. So this is what these men looked like when they first arrived. 2 days later, they looked like this. They were forced to change their dress, cut their hair. They were had to attend English class, had to attend chapel. They had to do military drills. They had to do odd jobs for citizens in the town outside. They basically had to live a life of this transformation into quote unquote civilized living that the missionaries had wanted all along on the reservation, but had not been able to create. And here, in the setting of the prison, the man running the prison can really insist that it happen. So it's in this period that Zotam, the prisoner I showed you in the last slide, he thinks back to his homeland. He thinks back to his experiences there. He's also experiencing new things. And while he is kind of going through these experiences of remembering and experiencing new things, he draws. And he draws all kinds of notebook pages, and we have many of these kept in museums around the country. This is a drawing he made while he was in prison of the Sundance Lodge. He was remembering what it was like to take part in the Sundance back in his home territory. But he also drew about his new religious experiences, including going to the prison chapel and listening to sermons, hearing hymns, being taught the Lord's Prayer, being taught Bible verses. This is also an experience he drew about as he was imprisoned at Fort Marion. When the prisoners were finally freed, about 3 years after their arrival, Zotam was taken to New York. He was taken there by a group of missionaries. They took 4 young men, both Kiowa and Cheyenne and Comanche, and Zotam was among them. He's standing there second to the right. And they basically said they were going to do a kind of homestay program. They wanted these young men to come there to learn even more Bible lessons, to learn even more farming and skills to take back to the reservation. And they would do that by living with Christian families. So Zotam and these other men lived in upstate New York for 2 years. On the right, you can see that there is a news article about when they are baptized in an Episcopal church during that period. And so the folks in this community who are hosting them for this homestay and hoping to transform them, basically not only baptize these young men, but also ordain them as ministers to go back to their reservation as the very first missionaries. And that's exactly what Zotam does. In 1879, he returned home. And he was really among the very first missionaries to come to Kiowa country, besides the Quakers who had been there earlier. And when he was there, he had the advantage of being someone who could speak the native language. So he taught Sunday school, he read the Bible, he preached, and in a few months, he had actually convinced some of his relatives to be baptized. But then it was time for the Sundance. And Zotam wanted to go. The white missionary, the Episcopal missionary who was his kind of superior, basically said, don't do it. You cannot do it and be a Christian. But Zotam wasn't so sure. He was dedicated to his work as a missionary, but he also wanted to go to the Sundance, and he did. And he basically got fired for doing it. He would actually come back to the church over time, but he also insisted on his ability to do these older traditions as well. And here I think we can see this additive quality. He did not necessarily think you had to give up something from the past in order to experience the new powers available through Christianity. Now, the white missionaries disagreed, but they had a different idea about what could be added in any religious system. For Zotam, he saw this as a really flexible situation in which you could access many powers. And he continued to over the course of his lifetime. So I just want to show you 2 other little historical documents. On the left, way down at the bottom, this is a recreated typewritten list from the very first Baptist church opened among the Kiowa. And it shows down at the bottom that Zotam got baptized again. So he's already been baptized by the Episcopals. He still goes to the Sundance. Here we see he got baptized by the Baptists. And if we look over on the right, we find out that later he still does even more stuff. This is a letter warning the administrator of the reservation that there are men ingesting peyote and that there are men participating in the Plains Indian ghost dance, and Zotam is on both lists. So he really is adding everything possible in this moment. And in his mind, there's no problem with it. So I want to talk about peyote for a little bit, the very last, I think, major addition that occurs for Kiowas at this time. So you'll remember that these are folks who did the Sundance. There are some who are availing themselves of Christian affiliation, but practicing the sun dance is becoming harder and harder. The missionaries are discouraging them. And in the 1880s, there's a set of rules put forward by the federal government's Indian office, basically forbidding sun dances to occur. They basically outlaw sun dances, and people could be fined or even imprisoned for doing so. So there's many years in the 1880s that when Kiowas tried to perform the sun dance, troops from the nearby military base come out and supervise them and even stop them. It becomes just much more difficult for them to practice the traditional ways of interacting with supernatural power. And they wrote about these things in their historical records. In fact, they wrote about the ways that they basically had to stop. These are all entries from different calendars that Kiowas made to remember the year 1890. And the year 1890 was the last year they tried to do the sun dance. And all of them, these entries that you see here, show somehow an unfinished sun dance. Either it's cut in half, like the one on the left, or the one in the middle and on the right just doesn't have any offerings draped upon it, doesn't have a buffalo hide draped upon it. They were not able to complete the ritual because the army came and stopped them. So they're at this point where their most important ritual has been taken away. And they've been under pressure to give it up for some time. So one thing that happens is that there's this memory of peyote, right? They knew some Kiowas, like Croneck, had ingested peyote, learned about it from other tribal nations earlier. And now it seems like this might be something that could be very useful for them to access. And it can be done in secret, outside the surveillance of Americans. So I just want to show you another drawing. This is by a Kiowa man named Silverhorn. And what we can see here, we as the viewers here can actually see inside this teepee, there's a peyote meeting happening. The men are sitting in a circle. There are men holding ritual implements like rattles. They're singing. There would also be a fire. There would be a long, long period of prayer and song before ingesting peyote. This is a peyote meeting happening. But of course, unlike this picture, if you were an American observer at this time, you couldn't see what was happening inside that tent, right? This was something that could happen outside the surveillance of Americans. And it's during the late 1880s and into the 1890s. Some scholars think that somewhere between a quarter and a half of the Kiowa population began to ingest peyote as a way to experience supernatural empowerment. So once again, I think we're seeing that this additive quality, this openness and flexibility to new forms of power is really kind of gives the Kiowa people in this very difficult point in their history some options, some flexibility, and they take it and they use it in different ways. But we also know that they were living among Americans who did not have the same view about religion being something that could be added to, about religion having an additive quality. So this was something that kind of came between Kiowas and Americans, but Kiowas really persisted in this additive quality, and they continue to have this additive quality to their religious practice today. And I would say the same of many Native people. The stats say that 50% of Native Americans affiliate in some way with Christianity, but many of those folks also have affiliations with other kinds of tribal traditions. So that additive quality continues. And I'd be really happy to talk about that and take your questions. But I just want to say one last thing. Even though I think it's important to recognize the additive quality of Native American religions and how that operated for them in the time of colonialism and conquest, I think it's important to remember that every religion has at least some dimension of an additive nature. They might be more restrictive about it. They might have different rules about what can be added, but every religion changes. And many traditions have grown up when there's been an effort to add something, pardon me, that perhaps some people agree with and some don't. So one way we could think about additive qualities in many religious groups is to think about the way there is the Jewish tradition and Jewish people in their history, but but that there are those who come out of that tradition and affirm that Jesus is the Messiah. Many Jews disagree. These folks want to add something new. Eventually, that disagreement leads them into a kind of separation of the ways, right? There's this effort to add, which some people say no to, which others agree to and want to go on with their new tradition. Eventually, you can say the same thing about Islam, right? There is the addition of a new prophet and a new revelation, a new scripture. There are some folks who say, no, we don't see that as a viable addition, and others who do, who then go their separate ways. We can also say the same thing about the way that Buddhism emerges out of Hindu tradition. So there might be stricter rules, there might be different ways that a community discerns what can be added, but really every tradition has some additive nature, because every tradition changes over time. None look exactly the way they did centuries ago. It's just that I think that Native traditions, it's a little bit more pronounced, and it's one of the ways that they were able to navigate the history of colonization. So that's a little bit about the changing face of Native religions, and I'm really happy to take your questions.
First question is, how does the use of peyote affect people's behavior and perceptions of what is happening around them? Was this an issue between settlers and the Kiowa?
Yes, it was. So one of the ways I talk about this with my students is that for many Native people, when they think about peyote, the main word in English that they would use to describe it is medicine. Whereas many non-Native people, when they hear the word peyote, the main word they would use to describe it is drug. And one of the reasons most non-Native people would come to that conclusion is that, first of all, peyote is classified as a class 1 drug, along with things like heroin and cocaine. And that's because it has an alkaloid called mescaline in it. And mescaline does have psychotropic qualities. If you talk to Native people, the psychotropic qualities of it, or the way that it inspires what they talk about as visions, is part of a kind of larger understanding of how peyote works. So yes, it does have the effect. Often, many practitioners describe it as being very aware, perhaps like having lots of caffeine. Sometimes they see things like colors and sounds. But this is something that's practiced communally under the leadership of some kind of elder. And it's usually held for a particular purpose, healing, petitions, and it's part of a whole set of rituals that take a kind of all-night meeting to accomplish. So I think it's important to remember that along with those kind of sensory experiences that certainly are affected, and people really claim visionary experience, that it's part of a kind of larger, it's a part of a larger practice that has other elements as well.
Thank you. Was there ever confusion of the symbol of the peyote button for the cross?
Yes. Actually, there's two ways that symbolism in Kiowa art and Kiowa shields and teepees and rock painting could have overlap with the Christian cross. Peyote is one because it has the little hatch marks that make a cross on the top of the peyote button, but also the morning star was something that was a kind of an icon that was on a lot of Kiowa teepees and ledgers. It was thought to be a powerful object. And so it looks a little bit like this as well. So for some missionaries, there was a sense that the Kiowa already venerated something like a cross. And sometimes for missionaries, they would say, okay, we're going to show you what the real cross is. You've got this cross, but it's really the cross of Jesus. Other missionaries, namely Catholics, basically said, hey, it's the same thing almost. And one thing that was really popular was when Catholics distributed rosaries, which have a cross on them. So there definitely was a fluidity there, depending on the observer.
Great, thank you. When there's broad brush discussion of Native American religions, how much is genuine overlap and interconnectedness, and how much is a European desire to simply categorize?
Oh, this is a great question because some people would say that we really just shouldn't even talk about Native American religions. Like we shouldn't just put that phrase together because there are at least 500 distinct tribal nations that have histories here in North America. And that we really, some of them have kind of an overarching supreme being, some don't. Some have personified deities, some don't. They just have this general sense of power. There's a lot of difference in these communities. And I would say that there's also change over time, right? To talk about Kiowa religion today is something very different from 1890, which is something very different from 1790. So there's a lot of ways you can complicate this idea, but I do think there's a few things that we can generalize, and that the to me the most important is that these religions emerged to protect and serve and sustain distinct tribal communities, right? These were for the tribal community, and they weren't necessarily to be given to outsiders. There was no desire to draw outsiders into them. This was for the sustenance of those communities, especially in the particular time place in which they lived. So I think that that is one thing that we could generalize about, that that's what these religions function for. But then we have to ask, okay, what is the time and place for each of these different groups?
Thank you. How have Kiowa understood the category of religion? Do they take up the category on their own? Is it in a way indigenous to them, or is it something that's imposed on their practices? How is it efficacious to them socially, culturally, and politically, or not?
Very good question. There is no word for religion in the Kiowa language, but they do realize that it is an English word with power once they are having more and more interaction with Americans, and they do start to use it. It's not in the period that I study, but shortly thereafter, in the early 20th century, they learn that things that get the classification religion have constitutional protection. And so they go to the Oklahoma state legislature, along with some other Native nations, and say, Peyote is our religion. And they start something called the Native American Church, and they seek constitutional protections by saying they should be classified as a religion. So they eventually begin to use that language, but prior to their real interactions with English-speaking people, that is not a concept that they really had a term for.
What can you tell us about peacemaking and war between Native peoples and Christians because of religion and the force to change?
So I would say one thing that really kind of troubled me and I really struggled with while I was working on this book was that I was reading a lot of work by missionaries who really absolutely believed in the need for cultural transformation of Native people, including the transformation of their religious lives. Most of them, I would say, were people that did not want that to be brought about by force. And when they thought about force, they were thinking things like the US military or forced removal, as happened under Andrew Jackson after the Indian Removal Bill. So in their minds, they did not want when they said that they didn't want force, they really meant things like the Army and legislation that would be enforced by the Army. However, they did in varying degrees deal with and really use force and coercion in other ways. So these were people who operated schools in which children could receive corporal punishment if they spoke their own language, or they were forced to cut their hair, of course, forced to change their clothes, forced to take English names. These were people who sometimes took children to school against their parents' wishes. These were folks who at times forced changes in settlement, not necessarily thousands of miles, but certainly demanded change in location for various groups of people within reservation boundaries. So there's a lot of coercion. that happens often by these folks making rules and then calling on the army to sort of back them up if things aren't put into motion. So there's a real environment of threat, even as missionaries really saw themselves as different from the U.S. military. And it's true that they did not promote in various ways forced change.
Thank you. Is it possible to interpret from the Kiowa perspective what their lives were and are like, and what was the average lifespan during the early period of colonization and into the 20th century?
Very good question. So the Kiowa, like many Native nations, suffered significantly from various epidemics throughout the 19th century. So these would be cholera, measles, yellow fever, influenza many times. So they definitely experienced those epidemics, and those were extremely dangerous for children and older people. So if you made it through childhood, you actually had a pretty good chance at a long life, but they really did suffer with child mortality in the 19th century. One thing that's really interesting today is that there are many Kiowa people who live to be over 100 years old. Whenever I go up to the area that's the former reservation where they have their tribal headquarters, I'm always amazed by the fact that someone is having a 100th birthday party. They really have this astounding longevity. So I don't know what it is about them, but they really actually have many long-lived members. But it's very true that there has been real suffering at times because of disease, and then also younger people lost to illnesses that have kind of affected Native America very dramatically, things like diabetes.
Thank you. As a scholar studying religion of people who are marginalized, both historically and presently, can you talk about how you think about questions of accountability and care?
Yeah, so one thing that's very common in the field of Native studies or Native American and Indigenous studies, even for people like me who are historians and writing about the past, there's a sense that you have an obligation to not only address the present, right, and talk about the present state of these tribal nations, but also to be in relationship that's beneficial to those tribal nations. So this is something that's actually very different than other subfields in history. So one of the things I have done over the course of my research, I have been up to the reservation several times. I meet with folks at the church. There's a couple of different churches there that I've met folks with at the tribal headquarters, at the tribal museum. I've gone to some ceremonies that are held, like ceremonial dances. And one thing that was really important to me was to find a way for the research I did to benefit Kiowa people. And so I met with folks at the tribal museum, and one of the things that we worked on together was that I could use my research about those calendars with all the different entries for the different years. I collected lots and lots of images of those calendars when I went to all sorts of museums. I built a website, and now they use the website on one of their consoles in their museum. So the sense was like, not only do I not want to burden them with requests for them to give me things, but rather my sense is that I have an obligation as a historian and as someone who's paid to do this work, to give in a way that benefits them.
That's fantastic. Do you know what diseases afflicted Native peoples that were not brought on by Europeans?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, I mean, certainly ones that you could get because of tainted water, right? That didn't necessarily occur because of Europeans. But I would say that most of the things they were struggling with in the 19th century were what we call these virgin soil epidemics that include things like the measles, scarlet fever, and cholera. Or sorry, not cholera, measles, scarlet fever, and whooping cough.
Thank you. Did Americans rename the sun dance the scout dance, or did Native peoples also refer to these religious dances as scout dances?
I've never heard that phrase actually. And it's interesting now, many Native people who are speakers of English will talk about that ritual with the English phrase Sundance. But every Native nation that practiced a variation on the Sundance would have had their own language term for it. So in Kiowa, that word is Skaado, but the Lakota would have had a word of it for it. The Crow would have had a word for it. Every nation would have had their own word for it, and each one would have had some slight variations on how they practiced it. And it basically got that English name Sundance from American observers, and now it's just kind of stuck.
Is there any evidence of how Kiowa traditions or others may have influenced or even been incorporated into other religious traditions like Christianity?
That's a really good question, and I would say that, and this is actually my answer. In some ways, comes from experience in which, in Oklahoma at least, where many Kiowas live and where their former reservation is, a lot of Native people who actually do affiliate with churches are in churches that are mostly with other Native people. In fact, so let's take, for instance, the Protestant denomination, the United Methodists. There are two places in the United States where the Methodists have a separate, what they call Indian conference. One of them is in Alaska and one is in Oklahoma. And so they have several Indian Methodist churches. And some of them include Kiowa members. I met Kiowa members at a place called Hunting Horse United. So many, where I have the most experience, they are folks who go, if they go to church at all, they are in churches that have mostly other Native members. I would say, though, that would be different in other places. And one of the places that would be most different, I think, would be in Roman Catholic churches, because there has been this effort across the United States among Roman Catholic churches to kind of break down the sense that, this is the Native church, this is the Polish church, this is the Italian church. There's just been effort to kind of not have everything be based on ethnicity. It's still true to some extent, but there you might see a little bit more mixing of Native people with people who are not Native in a congregation.
Thank you. And we'll make this the last question so you have plenty of time to answer. Can you tell us more about Native American and Indigenous studies and the program's research priorities and projects in the College of Liberal Arts?
Great, yes. And I'll say this, I was not originally trained in Native American studies. My training was in religious studies, and I work with historical methods, so I'm really a historian of religion. And my primary training was in Christianity and Judaism in the United States. But I had research questions that really took me toward Native American and Indigenous studies. And so this was something I came to after my PhD training, and was really accelerated for me by coming to UT, because we have a program in Native American and Indigenous studies. We have some really strong faculty members, and we actually house the Journal for Native American and Indigenous Studies, the academic professional society for the whole field is housed here at UT and edited out of UT. We've actually hosted the national conference for the society here at UT. So there's a lot of energy here around the intellectual work of Native studies. And I would say that kind of the priorities include making sure that Native scholars are a part of these conversations, that there is an effort to what we would call decolonize many parts of our intellectual life that either marginalize Native people or stereotype Native people, or only use sources written by non-Native people to talk about Native people. So really trying to center the lives, voices, and experiences of Native people, because they've been marginalized not only in American society, but also in our, in my case at least, in the history books. I talk to my students about what they learned growing up in Texas in their 2 years of Texas history that you get in the K through 12 experience. And many of them feel like they just know nothing past the founding of Texas. When it comes to Native people, they might know some of the people who were present and a little bit about them prior to the founding of the Republic, but really nothing afterward. And so my sense is we have so much work to do in Native studies to really put Native people at the center of American history, put them at the center of Texas history, and not really treat them as folks who are on the margins of that story, but who are really central to that story, and then using things that they produced. And in my case, that meant using things like the calendars and the shields and the drawings as a way to get at their perspectives.
Great, thank you. On behalf of the University of Texas College of Liberal Arts Development and Public Affairs teams, we want to thank Dr. Graber and all our attendees for sharing your valuable time with us.